What if your best looking safety number is the one hiding your biggest risks? For years, companies have leaned on measures like lost time injury frequencies and total recordable injury frequency rates to show whether safety is improving. Lower rates equals good news and higher rates equals bad news, apparently. But two reports from Sharon O'Neill and colleagues argue that this logic can be badly misleading because injury rates are often treated as if they measure safety when they don't. As one of the reports puts it, measures of injury and illnesses don't measure the health and safety of the work environment, nor are they a reliable indicator of work health and safety performance. G'day everyone, welcome to Safe As. I'm Dr. Ben Hutchinson. Today we're exploring the limits and traps of safety performance reporting systems, incentives, and also annual reporting, based primarily on two reports. Number one is from O'Neill, Wolf and Holly, 2015, titled Performance Measurement, Incentives and Organisational Culture, Implications for Leading Safe and Healthy Work, from Safe Work Australia. And second, from O'Neill and Wolf, 2017, titled Measuring and Reporting on Work Health and Safety Report, from Safe Work Australia also. The first problem is aggregation. The 2017 report states that a single injury number or frequency rate is too aggregated to provide meaningful information to guide business decisions. Now, not all injuries are, of course, alike. Some are short-term and relatively minor. Others permanently alter a person's life. But once they're collapsed into a single rate, you lose the distinctions that matter most. The report says that the majority of lost time injuries, or LTIs, have relatively short-term consequences. And because low consequence injuries occur more frequently, LTI data provides a general indicator of relatively minor events, but no useful insight into the occurrence of more damaging injury and illnesses. Using a data set of more than 400,000 work-related injuries, the authors show that the same underlying cases can tell two different stories depending on how they're classified. They argue that the results illustrate that a steadily decreasing trend in LTIs over time can hide a significant increase in the most damaging and costly group of non-fatal injury over the same period. And other research from Bayona et al. 2024 shows that, in their data at least, the mechanisms and proximal causes that lead to fatal or severe injuries may be distinct from those that lead to relatively minor injuries, including the types and magnitudes of the energy present, types of controls that are used, and a number of other factors. So, minor and major incident potentials might be quite different. The report indicate a key issue being risk blindness. A board looking only at a falling LTIFR can easily conclude that safety is improving, even while the organisation remains exposed to serious or permanently disabling harm. The risk exposures. Hence, paraphrasing the report's findings, a board receiving only injury and incident measures would be likely to draw very different conclusions as to the success of past safety efforts and the appropriate focus on future safety attention than those receiving data on, let's say, control or system effectiveness and the like. Now, the reports don't say that injury data is completely useless. In fact, they're more careful than that. They can be useful, but in their words, not for making decisions about health and safety. The 2017 report says that LTI key performance indicators are useful for understanding the impact of poor safety decisions on business productivity, but not for judging whether hazards are controlled or whether safety is improving. So if you want to understand disruption, time away from work, lost productivity, or reporting practices, injury data can help. But if you want to understand whether critical risks are being controlled or understanding the severity of events, then LTIs and TRIFRs and all that sort of stuff doesn't really assess these facets, nor the effectiveness of controls. Therefore, in their words, injury measures have been incorrectly presented as evidence of the success of safety efforts, even though it fails to measure safety performance at all. The second problem is what happens when these numbers become targets. The 2015 report on performance measurement and incentives warns that, in their words, in the absence of a reporting culture, focusing on injury results is likely to drive people to manage the measure. They provide examples like concealing injuries, reclassifying them to seem less concerning and improving results on paper while actual performance remains unchanged. The classic paper safety system. Now, this is where weak metrics become a form of symbolic management. The report says injury frequency rates may motivate underreporting or misreporting, may lead to bullying of injured workers, or pressure for premature return to work, and that a low LTIFR or TRIFR may be falsely interpreted as evidence that health and safety risks are well controlled. So the use of measures in these ways may actually change the type of work organizations do. If workers, supervisors, or managers know they're being judged on the numbers start shaping behavior. And if the number is poorly chosen, the behaviors it drives can be exactly the opposite of what you want. Research has also found similar effects of measures and targets being managed over the core issues. They've called these effects surrogation and quantification fixation, among other terms. Now, the report is particularly blunt on employee incentive schemes tied to injury reductions. It says these schemes are inherently flawed since many causal factors are not within the employee's control. Interestingly, Deming was also critical of holding people accountable for performance targets that sit outside of their locus of control and sit largely with the overarching system or organization. The social consequences can get particularly bad when these schemes are group-based. The report says they can create peer pressure for underreporting and lead to injured workers being blamed or bullied for the team's loss reward or bonus. Some research suggests that up to 80% of the incidents experienced by workers remain unreported. And really, who wants to jeopardize the pizza party by breaking the 5 years LTI-free record? Further, the report doesn't stop at frontline incentives, but it extends this argument onto the executive remuneration also. In other words, it's what leaders are paid to care about. As covered in these articles, CEO bonuses often far exceed their fixed pay, and most annual bonus criteria only include a small percentage related to safety, usually tied to a LTI or TRIFR or something similar. Therefore, long-term incentives were paid almost entirely on financial performance. In other words, safety can be publicly and socially framed as a priority while remaining structurally secondary in the reward system. The report says executive incentive structures may motivate a short-term orientation to organizational performance, as in financial performance, and pose a strong disincentive to spending on health and safety. So you incentivize massaging the numbers rather than addressing the actual core issues. In research from Hopkins and Maslin, they noted a company assessed as having performed marginally above target, despite 2 workplace fatalities and an injury rate well above target. This captures how cosmetic that safety bonuses can become when the broader remuneration architecture is dominated by financial goals and easily gamed or massaged incident measures. So if these injury measures and the supporting control structures are weak for these goals, and if tying them to rewards can distort behavior, what do the reports suggest instead? The 2017 report argues for a multi-dimensional view of health and safety reporting. Officers need information about their risk picture, their performance and assurance. Simply, that means understanding the hazards that expose people to harm, the controls put in place to manage those hazards, and whether those controls are implemented, whether they're effective, and what verification exists that the system is working. The reports also point towards more useful injury reporting. Instead of collapsing everything into a one headline rate, they recommend distinguishing injury outcomes by severity. One of the reports says that the board should receive the number of actual injury cases by severity and not an aggregated injury rate. It also recommends reporting on hazards linked to the most damaging injuries and the most frequent injuries and major hazard potentials, along with the processes used to manage those risks and evidence as to their effectiveness. Interestingly, research from Kevin Getter shows that the original pioneers of injury measures from over 100 years ago recognized that injury frequency rates need to be coupled to severity measures. They knew this a long time ago. So in all, moving away from questions like, did the number go down? And towards questions like, what are our critical risks? Are they identified? What controls are in place? Are those controls working? How do we know they're working? What serious harm has or could occur? And what assurance mechanisms do leaders have that the controls and systems are actually functioning as intended? The 2015 report adds another useful improvement suggestion. Don't just count activities, outcome measures. Look at what those activities are producing. For example, it warns that measuring the number of incident investigations closed can drive quick, superficial investigations and easily addressed low-level risk controls. One suggested mitigation is to analyze investigation actions by the hierarchy of control level. For example, what proportion of actions actually eliminate risk, minimize risk at a high level, or rely only on administrative controls and PPE. This highlights whether the organization is learning and improving and driving continual risk reduction. Further, these same limitations are reflected in annual reporting, what's been called safewashing, adopting the greenwashing term. Studies from O'Neill et al. 2016 and Gardner 2022 highlight how only a small percentage of ASX-listed companies reported safety metrics at all. But no surprises, of those that did, injury measures were among the most commonly disclosed measures. While near misses were rarely reported, fatality disclosures were concerningly very limited, and investigation disclosures were often vague and incomplete. Of concern in the O'Neill study, some companies reported no fatalities in their annual reports, despite mentioning fatalities in other media over the same period, and few reports identified health and safety regulatory investigations, prosecutions, and fines. There were also inconsistencies in how metrics were calculated, including differences in the denominators, rolling average periods, contractor inclusion, and what counted even as an injury. Second, companies showed a clear preference for reporting response-based rather than severity-based metrics, even though severity-based metrics better reflect the consequences of injury and illness, at least of those things that are reported. So the external reporting picture often reproduces the same problems seen internally that we covered before: selective use of lagging indicators, weak comparability, very little serious discussion of near misses or investigations, what was actually learned and improved, and a tendency to report what is the easiest, most familiar, or most flattering rather than what best informs decision making. As Gardner states, the current work supports assertions by scholars and policy experts that voluntary reporting is ineffective. So based on all of this data, if you want to understand one element of productivity disruption, then use LTI, etc. to achieve that purpose. But if you want to understand the mechanisms that create risk and safety, then don't confuse injury rates with better control of risk. Look at severity, look at hazards, and the effectiveness of the systems and controls. The assurance pieces, and be very cautious about attaching rewards to injury numbers unless you want people managing the metric instead of managing the underlying issues. Overall, leaders, and probably most of us, can become blind to serious risk, and organizations can become skilled at producing better looking numbers. As Decker calls it, the looking good index. And these aren't the same things as creating margins of safety, nor assuring ourselves of it. That's it on Safe As. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and link in the show notes to support the channel.